Thank you very much for taking time out of your day to dial into this event hosted by the Regional Studies Association. I'm the chair to be guiding us along today. My name's Anne Rimmer. I'm a policy analyst in entrepreneurship education at the OECD's Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Cities and Regions. As I mentioned, today's event is hosted by the Regional Studies Association. And for those of you who are less familiar with the RSA, they are a global and interdisciplinary network for urban and regional research, development, and policy. They support its members with the latest research, funding schemes, networking, and publishing opportunities and spaces to grow research and careers. And they also host great events like today's. Before we sort of dive into the content of today's discussion, they asked me to flag another coming event, which sounds fascinating, which is the Regions in Recovery eFestival. It's a collaborative partner event that will be taking place from the 2nd to the 18th of June, and free registration for non-presenting delegates. So really a fantastic opportunity to take advantage of. It's sort of traditional to open an event like today's and say that the analysis that we're about to discuss is timely, but this couldn't be more true for putting universities in their place. What we see in the OECD is that the connection between higher education institutions and their communities has always been important, but is just growing and growing in relevance. So many of the biggest challenges facing our society, from building back better post-COVID to sustainability, the digital transformation, youth engagement, they all have ties and roots in the nexus of place responsiveness and universities. But how to achieve that place responsiveness is one of the famous wicked problems of policy. There is no easy solution. There's no one size fits all solution. And it's why I'm particularly looking forward to the conversation that we're about to dive into today, to understand how we can learn from each other from across the globe, to understand better the trends and really get under the skin of what is the relationship between HEIs, their region, and policy. The opportunity of an innovative, connected, and embedded HEI is simply too great for us to not take advantage of it. And so this is a really critical conversation that I'm looking forward to learning from. Before I sort of pass over the virtual microphone to our first presenter, I just want to remind everybody that we have a really good chunk of time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. So please do use the Q&A function throughout the presentations. We'll be monitoring that. The team from the RSA will be monitoring that, and we're going to look forward to sort of bringing out some of those questions and engage in quite a rich conversation with our very knowledgeable and insightful presenters today. So without further ado, I will pass it over to our first presenter of three. So Lucir Reinaldo Alves from the Western Parana State University of Brazil will kick us off. I always feel that people do the best job themselves of giving an overview of the bio, so I'll let him introduce himself and kick us off with the first presentation. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Anne, for the intro. Thank you, Regional Studies Association, for this opportunity to share a little bit about our Policy Expo book. As Anne has said, I am Lucir Alves. I work at Western Parana State University. I am an economist. I work here since 2008. I also am a researcher here in our Center for Regional Development. And these are my interesting areas. I love working with this kind of subject to understand the differences between regions, between cities, and about geoprocessing and, of course, the regional effects of higher education institutions. To start, I will share my screen with you. As Annie has said, our Policy Expo book is called Putting Universities in Their Place. To starting my presentation, I would you like to present the structure of our presentation? I will start with showing you the Expo team and a little bit about the background to the Expo. After, Louise will present the RFIC framework, and Maria Conceição will conclude and showing you some policy recommendations. Here you can see all the Expo team in this picture, and the names are in the order: Mark, Mauricio, myself, Louise, Maria Conceição, and Paul. We are from different places, from Brazil, from UK, from Portugal, and of course from different universities, kind of universities. Talking about universities, as Anne had said, when you talk about universities, this is a not new subject, because normally universities are associated with the qualification of the workforce. This is not new. But when we talk about what are the impact of our universities in their place, in their regional development, this is not old. And in the recent decades, many conceptual frameworks and models were created to show the different kinds of relationships between universities and the local and regional development, to help policymakers to understand these contributions, to help universities themselves. But in our team, we agree that these models cannot be used for all kind of universities in all kind of regions, because normally these models don't give sufficient attention to the impact of their regional context, for example, the economic, the social, the political, that are very, very different when we comparing the regions, the different regions in different countries. And normally when we use these models, they rarely work outside of the immediate contexts, because they were created to this kind of context for this kind of regions. And when we talk about universities and institutions, this picture shows us how the number of students increased in the last decades. Of course, we know that the increasing of the students are associated with the increasing of the institutions in all kinds of countries and regions, mainly in the middle income countries and in the upper middle income countries, but also in lower middle income countries and low income countries. Then how many new institutions, how many new relationships we have during this time? Because these our research questions are: what are the different roles that universities play in local and regional development, and how do these manifest themselves? How we can learn from comparing practice and experiences internationally? And what are the internal and external factors? The internal factors such as management and leadership, history of the university, what is the mission of the university, the structures the universities have, and the external factors as territorial development policy contexts, the governance system, the nature of the place. using these internal and external factors, this will help us to explain the nature of the relationship and stay with these internal and external factors in mind, because they will shape the university in the region, and the region will be shaped by the university themselves, can be shaped. And of course, if there is many characteristics, many demands in the region to the university probably will have different missions to offer to the society, to the region. What I'm trying to say is that the kind of mission the university have depends on these contexts, these factors, internal and external. And of course, all these missions you can see with details in our book. Is a very complex relationship, and this citation from OECD emphasizes that in the past, neither public policy nor the higher education institutions themselves have tended to focus strategically on the contribution that they can make to the development of the regions where they are located. And what our research demonstrates with this book is that the reality is not homogeneous, it's totally heterogeneous when you are talking about higher education's configurations between places. And this complexity you can see in this picture. Here are all topics that that are detailed in our book. You can see everything there with many details. And here we have the characteristics of the university, the size, the age, the kind of missions the universities have, and also the characteristics of the regions that are very complex and multiple. The regions can be more innovative or not. We have different policy context, economic context, and the university can be a very important regional actor or not. And a question for all of you I would like to make is, will all universities offer these roles, these missions? Will all regions offer these characteristics to the university? And we can summarize this complexity when we analyze the relationships between institutions and regions with this picture. Our team think we have to start understanding the institutional characteristics, the governance of the regional development, the characteristics of the place, the national and regional policy contexts. With this, we can understand what type of institutions we have. What are the really contribution of the institutions to the regions and to the country? And to conclude my part, I want to emphasize our purpose. Our book develops both a new universities and regional economic development policy framework, we call RFIC framework, and also a set of recommendations for universities and policymakers to understand the role of and the contribution of universities in regional development. These are the both topics we will continue present you, and I conclude my part here. And I think we call Louise to continue.
Thank you, Lucir. And thank you to Anne for sharing this session for us today. And of course, thank you to the Regional Studies Association for not only hosting this, but also funding this policy expo and supporting us through to the publication, the recent publication of the book. So I'll talk you through, following on from Lucier's introduction, I'll talk you through now this framework that we developed as part of this policy expo and how we think this may provide a practical framework for action for both universities and their regional partners and policymakers. So just to give you a quick overview of the approach that we took. So starting with the framework that Lucir presented in his second last slide, we wanted to test this out by exploring both the contribution of HEIs to regional development and how those matched against a set of regional and institutional characteristics in order to understand the impact of the contribution of HEIs. And I'll talk about those factors in the next slide in a little bit more detail. We ran a number of workshops and seminars with academics, policymakers and practitioners at various international conferences, including some of the Regional Studies Association conferences. And we used these over the course of the expo to develop and road test the key questions that we were exploring and building this understanding. We then developed this into an online consultation and call for evidence across the RSA membership, and we had 111 responses from members right across the world from every continent, which was great because we wanted to try and make sure that we had developed something that had some international application as well. And then from the analysis of the findings from the events and the consultation, we were able then to build out this new framework, which we were able to present at a conference in Brussels to academics and policymakers before finalizing it. And of course, all the detail of all of this you would find in the book. So, some of the key findings from the consultation and evidence call, just to share with you so you can understand how we got to the framework that we got to. So in terms of the contribution of HEIs, we asked a number of key questions. To what extent their core activities were aligned to regional needs, how committed the institution is to supporting regional development and whether that's seen as core activity or something more peripheral. And then internally, how the activities that support regional engagement are organized and whether that's done in a very sort of managed and structured way, or it's more of an ad hoc and motivated by individuals. And then how the HEI envisions its role in regional development. So whether it's, a strategic leader or more of a, responsive actor that provides support when required. So these were the questions that we explored around contribution. And then in terms of the regional and institutional characteristics to test against how those impacted or not on the contribution, we looked at the age and size of the HEI. And we defined and classified these. And again, this is all in the book about how we interpreted those factors, the regional configuration of higher education in the region, so whether there's many HEIs or few or one, the economic context of the region, and then the policy context for higher education and regional development within which the HEI operates. And that was mainly focused on the extent to which those policy is managed and controlled at the regional level, or it's more of a centralized. So then in terms of the findings then, and to see the impact of any of these on the nature of the contribution of HEIs, in terms of age and size, we found that younger institutions tended to be more regionally oriented than older research intensive universities who tended to have a more national and global orientation. And there's a number of reasons why this may be the case. For example, younger institutions may have been purposely set up to have a regional mandate, so it could be expected that they would be more regionally orientated. However, we did find that the younger institutions could suffer from lack of institutional capacity and resource to support engagement. So sort of ironically might be overlooked by policymakers who tended to focus more on the higher profile, older HEIs who had more institutional capacity for engagement. And we also found that size matters, and there were differences again in the nature of the contribution. So smaller HEIs often can be more specialized in particular disciplines, and these might not necessarily map onto the regional economic structure. And at the same time, larger institutions were less likely to align their research around regional need, and that's probably because larger institutions have to be very national and international in their focus in terms of not only for their research, but also in terms of staff and student recruitment. In terms of the configuration of higher education in a region, we found that where the HEI was the only HEI in the region, it was much more likely to see itself playing a central role in regional development. But this was not unanimous. And actually, the number of cases where the HEI was the only one in the region were actually quite few. So our message really there for policy would be that policymakers shouldn't just assume the automatic involvement of HEIs in shaping regional strategy purely on the basis that they are the only one in the region. It's not always going to be the case. HEIs that are one of several or one of many in the region were just as likely to align their teaching and research to regional needs as those that were a sole provider. And likewise, there was little difference in commitment to regional development between these different classifications. So having many HEIs or only having one HEI doesn't bring us to a sort of an automatic assumption about the contribution. Where HEI is one of several in the region, the organization, the internal organization of engagement does seem to be more dependent on the motivation of individuals. So that might require more complex mechanisms to ensure the right people get involved. When we look at the regional economic context, and again, we define this in the book, but what we were looking at here is whether the region was lagging or developed in terms of the national context, and then whether the country was developed or developing in terms of the OECD average. So we did find that the regional context has an impact. And those in lagging regions in developed countries and developed regions in less developed countries were the ones that were most likely to see their role as central and strategic, which might be because there's greater demands placed on institutions in these places, which could be a factor of institutional thinness, but there is sufficient absorptive capacity for the outputs of HEIs compared to lagging regions in developing countries. And we found there was a stronger alignment of teaching to regional need in less developed countries, which might reflect more of an emphasis on the human capital development role of higher education in these places, rather than, which is maybe more of there's more of an evolving role in terms of the broader contribution to regional innovation and development, which has been part of the context in developed countries for quite a long time. So it could be that the less developed countries are starting to catch up on that. We found that HEIs in developed regions in developed countries were actually relatively detached compared to the others, but that may be because there's a greater institutional thickness in those regions and perhaps a more national and international outlook across the economy more generally. And then the regional policy context. I think we may have started with an assumption that where there's greater regional autonomy, there would be more orientation to regional development. But actually, we found that wasn't necessarily the case. And really that HEIs in all places face the same demands and pressures for student recruitment, for funding, and all the things that we struggle with. And it's not necessarily the case that centrally, just because of policy is centrally controlled, that it would be spatially blind. So HEIs can still be induced and incentivized to play a proactive role with the right policy design, regardless of whether it's in a decentralized or a centralized context. And then another factor might be the wider institutional context for regional development. So places with so in terms of trying to understand why we don't see a greater level of orientation in more devolved systems, might be because those places may have a wider breadth of organizations with a regional remit. So the gaps and spaces for HEIs to fill might actually be less than in other more centralized regimes. So we do see this in some lagging places in very centralized systems, like, such as the UK, where there are fewer regional institutions that can perform these roles. So, you know, we don't have regional development agencies, for example. So it does create more gaps for the HEIs to fill. So just going to move on now quickly, because I'm conscious of time, to talk about the framework, which is obviously, again, just to emphasize, you can get all the detail of this in the book. So the word ORFIC, well, it's an acronym of the 6 elements of the 6 key elements of the framework, but we liked it because it's a word that means something that has an import that's not apparent to the senses or obvious to the intelligence. And we thought this nicely reflected the opaque and sometimes ambiguous nature of the relationship between universities and regions. So the 6 elements were orientation of higher education policy, governance of regional development, characteristics of the place, the type of HEI, its institutional characteristics, and then the contribution of the HEI. So each of those 6 elements is explored through 16 key questions, which were identified as important during our Expo. And we give 4 classification options against each to policymakers and their regional HEIs to consider. And some of these are clearly very objective, like the size of the HEI, for example. Others are more subjective or open to interpretation, so looking at the contribution and the role that it plays. So to mitigate the latter, we have suggested evidence sources for each of these, so that the correct option can be chosen. And we don't present this as a fixed or a normative model. It's really about helping to develop a flexible approach that can be then adjusted and tweaked according to local and institutional conditions. And it's based very much on a self-assessment process that should be jointly undertaken with the key stakeholders. And we would like to suggest that the framework can help guide policymakers and universities themselves to understand the implications of their specific context in determining the role and contribution of HEIs to regional development goals. So I'm not going to talk through this because it's far too detailed. It's all in the book, but this is just to give you an idea of the questions that we have, and then the options that are offered, and then the suggestions for how these would be evidenced. So this is the full framework. And I'll just finish by giving some thoughts about how we feel this might be used. So it can help in mapping the higher education landscape in a region, and help to understand what the implications of the number of HEIs, the size, the age of them, etc., might have for regional development. So just doing that mapping to get a sense of how, you know, what the landscape looks like. We think it can help build a more realistic understanding of the role and contribution of HEIs might be. And you know, we think this is important to manage expectations, so that, you know, where there are limited contributions, that's understood and recognized, and there's not too much expectation placed. It may help identify as well what some of the barriers or challenges for higher education involvement in regional development might be, and how these could be overcome through policy design. For example, is it about needing to develop mechanisms for building institutional capacity to engage? So it gives us a kind of a platform to have these conversations, and for policymakers then to understand how they can build that capacity if necessary. Where there's more than one higher education institution, which is the most common case, it can help to understand how the different roles they play can be aligned in complementary ways, so that policymakers can value the variety and diversity of the contributions different HEIs can make. And above the regional level, I think for national and international policymakers, it's understanding, this framework helps us to understand that almost all regions are different in their context and higher education landscape. There's great value, of course, in learning from other places, but what works in one place is unlikely to work in the same way in another. So it's encouraging policies that can be adapted and tailored to reflect the local conditions, which as geographers we think is really important, because place matters. So thank you very much. I'm going to pass over now to my colleague Maria Conceição, who's going to give some conclusions and recommendations for policy making. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Louise. I will share my screen. I think now you can see my screen shared with all of you. Good morning, first of all. Good morning, dear colleagues. Good morning to everyone who is here today discussing with us this the links of universities with territory and with the development. My name is Maria da Conceição. I am an economist, a professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Evora in Portugal, and a researcher in the CEFAG, Center for Advanced Studies in Management and Economics. Evora is a Portuguese, small, beautiful and warm city in the south of Portugal, near to Lisbon. My main research interests are on the areas of regional and urban development, economics of population, economics of education, and of regional effects of higher education institutions. So let's move on to the main conclusions and some policy recommendations that result from this book with the RSA. In fact, this book offers a wide range of perspectives on the relationship between higher education institutions and places where they are located. Through two main ways. One of them, a conceptual perspective that discusses some of the main models about the relations between highs and regions as a region and also regional stakeholders, of course. For example, the concepts of entrepreneurial university, engaged university, civic university, and others. And on the other hand, this book shows some ways in which universities can help regional economies become more resilient and adaptive to changes through their employment and expenditures, education programs, or research activities. I said we have these main barriers to the impacts of regional development from the action of the university, and to overcome these barriers, the university should be actively engaged in development of the regions. So, in order to improve regional engagement of higher education institutions, we identify some drivers for a better regional commitment. These drivers are aligned with the institutional and regional diversity and are focused on the domains of institutional characteristics, governance of regional development, national and regional policy context, and the characteristics of the places. All of them suggest the valorization of the local characteristics and the centralization of the decision making. It is okay with the slides for now?
Yes, great.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And now it is time for some policy recommendations. First of all, the policymakers should consider, in fact, the characteristics of each university like age, dimension, size, internal leadership, like Louise said. In fact, our research shows the reality is characterized by high levels of heterogeneity of higher education configurations between places. Also, policy makers should consider the strengths and the motivations of each institution in order to maximize their contribution. For example, in places with multiple higher education institutions, they may take on different roles in the regional development, depending on their individual characteristics and perceived position compared with the other institutions in the region. So they should consider the character of the regional context in the set of factors included in the construction of a collaborative framework. And for another reflection about the policy recommendations, we consider that policymakers should understand that there is no single plan for the role of higher education institutions in the regional development over time. It will evolve over time in response to external pressures and internal changes. Moreover, all the regional stakeholders should also define realistic goals, considering both the potential of higher education institutions and the regional needs. And for conclude, it's my obligation, I can say, to recommend to all regional stakeholders to use the ORFIC framework when working with the higher education institutions in the regions, to understand and also to map the main roles and the main contributions that are possible to implement it. So thank you very much for your attention, and I finish here this presentation. I will stop the share of the screen, my screen.
Thank you, Maria, Louise, and Lucir for a flawless single presentation across 3 countries and 2 continents. So an achievement to be proud of. We've got already some great questions coming through from the Q&A, and really I encourage everyone to keep them coming. I would encourage you to use the Q&A box rather than the chat box, because I can only monitor one at a time, and it gets very confusing, and I don't want to miss any good questions. So the first question is, I want to kind of jump in on, and I sort of direct this to the whole panel, which I may do for a number of these questions, but you already worked so flawlessly in the presentation, I assume you'll be able to answer the questions with equal seamlessness, is around the role of the pandemic. So previously to the OECD, I was working in the UK civil service in the Department for Education. And I remember really vividly in March and April last year, where we were trying to figure out what does this pandemic mean for universities, and were overwhelmed positively with just how much universities just cracked on and worked with their regions and responded to really specific regional needs, sort of without anyone sort of, I think, sort of nudging them or saying, are you doing this, just because they knew their regions, they knew the needs, and they did that work fantastically. And some have said the pandemic is a game changer for universities and their community engagement, and that we've accelerated massively in terms of what all parties thought they were capable of. And I guess I sort of wanted to get your take on, in the context of this work, do you think that trend will continue? Is this unlocked something that we were worried about, or has this, are we going to return to form this when the pandemic crisis slightly abates? So I'll open that up and I'll let you sort of Figure out who jumps in first.
Okay, I'll go. Even though I don't have a comprehensive answer to the question.
I don't think anyone does.
So, I mean, I can only really speak from our own experience kind of in Newcastle and in the UK. And yes, you know, there was this incredible mobilization of our student community. I mean, some of it was just totally kind of bottom up, you know, it wasn't directed, as Anna said. And even things like at the university, we have a big medical school. We graduated our medical students early so they could get straight into the front line and onto the wards. And obviously, universities like Oxford have been at the forefront of the vaccine. So yeah, there's been an incredible response. At the same time, academics have had to grapple with moving almost entirely to online teaching, you know, and get, you know, formats that, you know, a lot of us probably weren't that comfortable with in the past. So, you know, really kind of changing the way teaching has been delivered. Is it going to be a game changer? It could be. Okay, so I think it could be a real shift in how teaching is delivered. Will we ever go back to a full kind of classroom-based system now that we've seen that it can be done using other ways? I think there's a danger that I think in the next couple of years, you know, as we kind of feel the effects of the long tail of all of this, I think there is a danger that universities might sort of retrench and retreat back inside the ivory tower, as it were, because I think there's going to be huge pressure coming around the corner on us. There'll be huge pressure for those of us that depend on international student recruitment, you know, as long as travel restrictions are in place, or maybe people will become more nervous about moving around the world for education. If we're going to face into another austerity period, will there be reductions in funding? So I think it's shown us what the potential is, and it's shown us how much innovation there can be. And I think it's really critical now that policymakers don't do the knee-jerk reaction that then pushes universities back inside the four walls. So that is my kind of reflection rather than an answer.
No, that was really interesting. And I think you raised a lot of really important points, and the risk of a knee-jerk reaction being one we all need to monitor. I'm going to keep us going through the questions. Potentially this one for sort of Maria, and it's a question that sort of a number of people have sort of engaged with, and it's one after my own heart, which is how how would you measure or evaluate the alignment of teaching to regional needs? And obviously that's the issue of measurement and evaluation is a whole issue unto itself, but sort of under the premise of we measure what we value, and we want to value this type of interaction. What would you sort of say to that question?
Yes, thank you. And perhaps the teaching function of the higher education functions is perhaps the one that it could be more horizontal, more transversal in order to put a kind of in the students a lot of capacity to solve the problems. Independent of the where are the problems, if the problems are regional problems, or national problems, or international problems. Perhaps with the research and with the knowledge transference and with the making links with the regional partners, we can do better this function of aligned with the objectives of regional development. This is more strong, and this fact is more needed. As I can say like this, in the regions where the institutional density is lower, because the power and relevance of the higher education institution, it's much higher than in a big city or in a densely region. So I think the teacher, and when we work with our students, the best that we can do is to prepare them to think the better what it is possible and apply all their capabilities in order to help the organizations and the regions to solve the problems. I don't know if I have answered to your question.
I think it's a question to which there is no definitive right or wrong answer. It's one to sort of reflect on. Before I move to the next question, I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything to that. I'll keep us moving.
Sorry, Anne.
No, it's good. The next question, and I'll put Lucir on the hot seat this time, but these are somewhat arbitrary allocations, so please others in the panel jump in. Sort of one question that came up is, it's clear that universities' localization in the first place will have sort of a strong impact on their behavior inside the region. And the question was, are we aware of successful university localization methodologies in a national regional context in view of the question of efficiency and effectiveness? And sort of, I guess, are there success stories that we should be learning from? Maybe is another way of framing the question.
Yes, and thank you. I think this is a complex question, and my answer is, I don't think so. We have this university localization methodologies, very well developed to understand this context in view. And I will talk a little bit more about my case in Brazil. We have a big problem to understand, to evaluate policies in general. And when we talk about efficiency and effectiveness, it is an evaluation of a policy. We can see this problem also when we talk about universities and these methodologies. I think this is a huge area we have to improve with more studies, with more methodologies development. I am not sure if I answered correctly your question, but I think this is very complex, and we have mainly in not developed countries a lot of things to increase, to understand these relationships, this efficiency, this effectiveness better.
So a work in progress.
And can I add something? Can I add something? The location of universities throughout the countries, mainly in the less developed countries with GDP below of the medium and so on, it's educational policy, of course, and is a tool of educational policy, but is also a tool for territorial development policy. And we never should forget the both sides of this equation, because the territorial effects of location of a university in some ranging regions, for example, are important not only for the economic direct effects and the immediate direct economic effects, but also because the institution comes like an example for the others by the way the people act, by the things that they do in terms of, for example, of culture, of relation to the others, of the contribution to the all to the society. It make links with the other organizations, and it's a way to improve all the other organizations, not for the exercise of the functions of teaching and research and so on, but by the informal links that the people have in the city, in their lives, in the school of the children, in the sports and so on. So in the regions where the institutional density and where economic density is lower, the existence of higher education institutions is sometimes the most relevant institution and the most important source of knowledge.
You raised so many good points there, and so many things that I know that we've been reflecting on a lot in the OECD about this notion of not just looking at education policy as regional development policy, and thinking about the multiple roles that many of these organizations play within their region, and both breaking down barriers and deepening understanding for policymakers, but also within institutions. It feels like this is a conversation that is happening over and over again in lots of different places right now, and is one where I think this framework can really help us untangle and move forward in a really useful way. One of the questions that's just come in, which I think is a really interesting one, is as you sort of look at your framework and its 6 elements, do you think that there's sort of the data is available to make the assessment on that framework, or is data gap a real issue? Because sometimes, and maybe it's sort of, you mentioned the self-assessment's part of that. So actually, until an institution does it itself, but I just was wondering how much is a lack of information a barrier to sort of moving forward with a framework like the one you just presented, and if it is an issue, is that are certain areas struggle more with that data than others? I don't know if anyone wants to jump out. I can pick on Louise.
Yeah, it's my turn, isn't it? Yeah. So thanks for the question. And I mean, it's not an evaluation framework. So it's not about sort of benchmarking where you are and sort of where you're going to get to. It's really just about sort of understanding the higher education context in a particular region, and how the different institutions play different roles and so on, and what that might mean in terms of what a realistic policy design might be. So, you know, for example, if you've got 2 institutions in your region, they're not research intensive, the teaching they do isn't in any way aligned to the regional needs, you know, then having a policy that's built around institutions that are aligned to regional need wouldn't work. So it's really just kind of a tool for understanding. So in terms of the data, I think, you know, there's a number of kind of quite objective questions around size and, you know, age and things like that. So yes, of course, every institution will have the data for that. And then there are a number of things that I guess they're a bit more subjective, or maybe require a bit more thought. We do in the UK, I mean, this question I think particularly came from a UK context. We do have things like the HEPSIS survey that every institution has to fill in. So there is a certain amount of data that can be drawn on that could be used to evidence if an institution's claiming it's deeply regionally engaged, that could be used to either challenge or back that claim up. But again, it's really, I suppose it's allowing universities to think about, well, what kind of role do they feel they should be playing, or what kind of role do they want to play? And then for the policy makers then to understand what the implications for that might be. You know, if you have a university in your region that's a top 10 global institution, I mean, maybe you benefit more as a region from having that asset, even though maybe doesn't bring that many direct links back into the region, but having those indirect links on a global platform might be incredibly valuable. And if you have other institutions that play a more regionally oriented role, then that could be very complementary. So it's a framework for understanding rather than a measurement or evaluation.
I think that was really important insight in terms of understanding and situating the framework. So thanks, Louise. I know we've got 2 minutes on the clock, but I'd like to just squeeze in one last question, if I might, which is looking at how HEIs create spaces of sort of innovative knowledge and in their regions with the link of ICT and digital. And just if you wanted to sort of, anything you wanted to say, and I don't know if Maria or Lucir, about sort of the role of HEIs in facilitating digital transformation in their regions, and if you came across anything on that in your research. Go for it, Lucir.
Okay, I can start. I think the creation of innovations networks depends on many factors we already had talked here, the science, the missions, the capacity of the university. And I want to highlight another characteristic that I think is very important, looking in the region I am now, is the organization of the region. There is organization in the region that thinks in the regional development. Nowadays in my region there is, and now the agents, the institutions are organized, including the universities, and they are looking for the needs of the regions to think how we can contribute with innovations and create spaces for it. I think we have to look at the both sides on the university, the capacity of the university, and also how is the region in terms of regional development, or is only national policies? There is no regional development. I think this is very important.
Perfect, thank you. And I think it's that is a note to conclude on in terms of the importance of regional development policy as we wrap up this webinar, probably 60 seconds over. So thank you everyone for your patience. So I'd like to really thank Maria, Louise, and Lucir for their fantastic presentations and for sharing their insights in this question and answer session. I know there's a lot that I'm going to be mulling over. I'd also like to thank everyone who asked questions, everyone who dialed in. I think we've had some really impressive global participation. A few of you have, I think, dialed in at a shockingly early hour in the morning, so I appreciate your dedication. And last but not least, let's thank the Regional Studies Association for funding this research and for making this webinar run flawlessly. So thank you to Lisa for making us all look good technically. So I'll wrap it up there and wish everyone a great afternoon. Goodbye.